There is a point in life where you stop needing more advice and you start needing more honesty. Because deep down, you already know what is draining you. You already know who keeps disturbing your peace. You already know which conversations leave you heavier, which relationships leave you confused, and which people only show up when it benefits them. But here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid: knowing is not the same as acting. And that is where your life gets stuck. Because toxic people don't destroy you in one moment. They destroy you in small permissions you keep giving. One ignored boundary, one tolerated disrespect, one it's fine when it wasn't fine. One explanation you gave when you should have stayed silent. One chance you gave when your instincts already told you the truth. And slowly, without realizing it, your standards don't collapse overnight. They slowly get negotiated away. So let me ask you something you might not want to answer honestly. How many times have you felt disrespected but still stayed quiet just to avoid conflict? How many times have you explained your feelings to someone who only listened to reply, not to understand? How many times Ave you stayed in a situation that was already finished in your mind, but not yet in your behavior? Because the real danger is not toxic people entering your life. The real danger is you getting used to what should have never been tolerated. And once that happens, you don't just lose peace, you lose clarity. You stop recognizing manipulation. You start questioning your instincts. You begin calling confusion normal. But today, what you are about to hear is not comfort. It is clarity. And clarity has a cost. Because once you see certain patterns, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand how control really works in relationships, you cannot go back to pretending you don't notice it. So the only question left is this: are you ready to see what has been controlling your peace all along? You need to understand something most people realize too late in life. Toxic people rarely arrive in your story like a storm. They don't break the door down. They don't announce themselves as chaos. If they did, you would protect yourself immediately. Instead, they arrive in a way that feels normal, familiar, even comfortable at first. That is the real danger, because the beginning of a toxic connection is often disguised as connection itself. It feels like shared laughter, shared attention, shared understanding. And in those early moments, your mind does what it is designed to do. It trusts patterns that feel socially safe. You don't analyze it. You don't question it. You simply accept it. But what most people miss is this: toxic behavior is not defined by one big moment. It is defined by repetition. It starts with something small that you decide not to address. A comment that slightly crosses a line, but you laugh it off. A joke that makes you uncomfortable, but you ignore it. A request that feels a little too demanding, but you say yes anyway. Not because you are weak, but because you are adaptable. You are trying to maintain harmony, and that is exactly where the shift begins. Because toxic people don't need permission to control you. They only need your tolerance. Once they see what you tolerate, they calibrate their behavior around it. Not all at once, but gradually. They increase pressure in small increments. They test boundaries like experiments. They observe your reactions, your silence, your hesitation. And every time you choose peace over confrontation, then, I interpret it as approval. This is how distortion begins. At first, you still feel in control. You still believe you are choosing patience, understanding, maturity. But slowly, something changes internally. You start editing yourself in real time. You start filtering your words before speaking. You start thinking twice before expressing discomfort. Not because you are naturally reserved, but because you are adapting to avoid conflict. And without noticing it, you begin to shrink emotionally in spaces where you should be expanding. This is not loud damage. This is quiet conditioning. And the most dangerous part is that toxic people rarely feel like enemies. In fact, they often feel familiar. They can be funny, charming, even supportive in certain moments. That inconsistency is what keeps you attached. Your mind begins to chase the good moments and rationalize the bad ones. You tell yourself things like, they didn't mean it, or that's just how they are, or it's not that serious. But every time you minimize what you feel, you move one step further away from your own clarity. And here is where psychological confusion sets in. Because now you are no longer reacting to behavior, you are negotiating with it. You are trying to interpret it in the most acceptable way so that you don't have to take action. But truth does not become less true just because you delay accepting it. Toxic people don't usually destroy your life in one decisive moment. They do it through accumulation, a collection of ignored discomforts, a pattern of dismissed instincts, a series of small moments that, over time, become your normal. And one day you wake up and realize something unsettling. You are constantly tired, constantly overthinking, constantly explaining, constantly adjusting, and you can no longer identify when things started feeling heavy. That confusion is not random. It is the result of gradual erosion. Because when your boundaries are repeatedly tested and not reinforced, your internal standard begins to dissolve. You stop asking, "Is this right for me?" and start asking, "Can I handle this again?" And that shift changes everything. Now you are no longer choosing relationships based on respect, you are choosing based on endurance. And endurance is not the same as strength. Strength protects your peace. Endurance just tolerates its absence. So when we say toxic people enter quietly, it means they enter through trust, familiarity, and small allowances. They don't need to break you immediately. They only need you to stay long enough in confusion that you start doubting your own perception. Because once you doubt yourself, you become easier to influence. And that is the point where many people lose control of their emotional environment, not because someone forced it from them, but because they slowly stop defending it. But here is the truth that changes everything if you are willing to accept it. No one can repeatedly cross a line you actively protect. The moment you recognize that toxicity is not a sudden event but a repeated pattern, you stop waiting for dramatic proof. You start paying attention to consistency. You stop justifying discomfort. You stop rewriting reality to preserve connection. And that is where real power begins, not in reacting louder, but in seeing clearer. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, you can no longer participate in it without full awareness. And awareness changes your choices. And changed choices change your life. So the real question is not who toxic people enter your life quietly. The real question is how long you allow silence to speak louder than your boundaries. Because the moment you stop ignoring small signs, you stop inviting big damage. And that is where your life finally starts protecting itself on your behalf. One of the clearest signs that you are losing yourself in a toxic dynamic is not the disrespect itself, it is what you do after it. It is the way you start explaining yourself more than you express yourself. The way you start justifying your discomfort instead of trusting it. The way you begin to believe that if you say the right words in the right tone at the right time, you can finally make someone respect what they were already choosing to ignore. And that is where the problem begins. Because over-explaining your boundaries is not communication anymore. It becomes negotiation. And the moment your boundaries turn into negotiations, they are no longer boundaries. They are suggestions. And suggestions are always open for debate. Think about how this plays out in real life. Someone crosses a line. You feel it immediately. That subtle internal signal, this is not okay. But instead of stopping the instead of letting that feeling guide your response, you begin to construct an explanation. You start searching for the perfect way to say it so the other person doesn't feel bad. So they don't get defensive. So they understand your perspective. But notice what is happening in that moment. You are no longer protecting your boundary. You are managing their reaction to your boundary. And that shift quietly puts your self-respect in second place. At first, it seems harmless. You are just trying to keep the peace. You are being reasonable, mature, understanding. But over time, something deeper happens. The more you explain, the more you invite debate. The more you justify, the more you open space for contradiction. And the more you defend your feelings, the more they begin to look like opinions instead of truth. And that is a dangerous transformation. Because your feelings are not arguments to be won. They are signals to be respected. But toxic dynamics often condition you to believe otherwise. They make you feel like your discomfort needs evidence, like your boundaries need approval, like your no needs to be soft enough to be acceptable. So you start adding layers to everything you say. You soften your language. You reduce your certainty. You wrap your truth in apologies so it doesn't sound too firm. And slowly, without realizing it, your communication stops reflecting your clarity and starts reflecting your fear of rejection. And here is what most people don't notice until much later. The more you explain your boundaries, the less seriously they are taken. Because clarity does not require volume, it requires firmness. And firmness does not mean aggression, it means finality. There is a difference between saying, "I don't like that, and here's why," and I hope you understand my point of view, versus saying, I don't accept that. One invites discussion, the other establishes a limit. And when you are dealing with toxic patterns, discussion is exactly what weakens you. Because discussion creates space for persuasion, and persuasion is where your boundary gets softened, reshaped, and eventually ignored. This is why people who lack strong boundaries often feel exhausted after conversations that should have been simple. Not because the issue was complex, but because they had to keep defending something that should have been clear from the beginning. And over time, this creates a psychological pattern inside you. You start associating boundaries with conflict. You start believing that asserting yourself leads to tension, so you avoid it, or you delay it, or you explain it so much that it loses its strength. But the cost of that avoidance is not peace. It is internal frustration. Because every time you over-explain, a part of you knows you didn't need to. A part of you knows your no was enough. A part of you knows you compromised clarity for comfort. And that internal conflict slowly builds resentment not toward others, but toward yourself. And that is where self-respect starts to erode quietly. Real boundaries are not performances. They are not speeches. They are not debates where both sides get equal say. Real boundaries are decisions about what you will and will not participate in. And decisions do not require approval. You don't need to convince someone to respect your limit. You need to define it and maintain it. That is it. Anything beyond that becomes emotional labor that drains your authority over your own life. Now here is the deeper psychological truth behind this behavior. People who over-explain boundaries are often trying to avoid guilt, not conflict. They are trying to make sure they are still seen as good, kind, or reasonable even while asserting themselves. But self-respect and external approval do not always coexist. In fact, they often conflict. Because the moment you choose yourself clearly, there will be people who benefited from you not doing that, and they will resist your clarity. They will question it. They will challenge it. They will act confused. They will try to pull you back into the version of you that explained too much and protected too little. And if you fall into that trap, you return to the cycle of negotiation. But if you hold your ground, something shifts. Not in them and you. You begin to realize that your peace does not require permission. Your limits do not require agreement. Your clarity does not require validation. And that realization changes your entire presence. Because when your boundaries are no longer dependent on explanation, you stop being emotionally available for manipulation. You become simple, direct, uncomplicated. And in that simplicity, something powerful happens. People start adjusting to you instead of you constantly adjust. To them. So understand this clearly. Every time you feel the urge to over-explain your boundary, you are not communicating more effectively. You are weakening your position emotionally. Say less, mean more. Stand firm, because the goal is not to be understood by everyone. The goal is to be respected by the right ones. And that begins the moment you realize your no was always enough even when you said nothing else at all. There is a point in life where you stop asking how to add more peace and you start asking why peace keeps leaving in the first place. And if you look closely, you will notice something uncomfortable but extremely important. Most people are not overwhelmed because of what they are adding to their life, but because of what they are refusing to remove from it. And that is where the truth becomes simple, even if it is not easy. Peace is not created by accumulation. It is created by elimination. This is something people resist deeply because we are trained to believe that better life comes from more friends, more connections, more understanding, more patience, more effort. So when relationships feel heavy, the instinct is always the same. Try harder. Explain more, be more forgiving, be more available. But here is the question you rarely ask in that process. What if the weight is not coming from a lack of effort, but from the wrong presence? Because not every problem in your life is meant to be solved. Some problems are meant to be removed, and that distinction changes everything. When toxic people remain in your environment, they do not just affect your mood. They affect your perception. They slowly distort your sense of what is normal. You begin to think that constant emotional tension is part of connection. You start believing that being drained is part of being loyal. You start accepting confusion as a natural state of relationships. And without noticing it, your baseline for peace drops. Now you are no longer asking, do I feel safe and respected here? Instead, you are asking, can I tolerate this a little longer? And that shift is subtle, but it is powerful. Because the moment you move from standards to tolerance, you stop choosing peace and start enduring discomfort. And endurance is not the same as strength. It is often just delayed exhaustion. This is why many people feel stuck even when they are trying to get there. They are best. They are not failing because they are weak. They are failing because their environment is continuously undoing their progress. You cannot heal in an environment that keeps reopening the wound. You cannot find clarity in a space that constantly creates confusion. You cannot build self-respect while regularly accepting behavior that violates it. But here is the difficult part. Removal feels uncomfortable at first, because your mind is not only attached to people based on logic, it attaches based on familiarity, routine, and emotional history. Even toxic dynamics create familiarity. Even painful patterns become predictable. And the human mind often prefers predictable pain over unfamiliar peace. So when you think about removing someone, you are not just thinking about the person, you are thinking about the emotional ecosystem built around them. The conversations, the memories, the shared identity, the version of yourself that existed in that connection. And that is why people delay removal. Not because they do not see the problem, but because they are attached to the pattern. But let's be very clear about something most people avoid saying out loud. Just because something G is familiar does not mean it is healthy. And just because you have invested time does not mean you should continue investing your peace. There is a difference between loyalty and self-abandonment. Loyalty says, I will stand by what is healthy, even when it is difficult. Self-abandonment says, I will stay, even if it slowly destroys me, because leaving feels uncomfortable. And toxic environments thrive in that confusion. They rely on your patience being stronger than your clarity. They rely on your empathy being stronger than your boundaries. They rely on your willingness to work things out even when nothing is changing. But here is what shifts everything. The moment you understand that peace is not something you negotiate for, it is something you protect. And protection sometimes requires distance, not emotional distance while staying physically present, not silent resentment while continuing the same access, but real, intentional removal of influence. Because every toxic presence in your life is not just a relationship, it is a drain on your mental clarity. It occupies space that could be used for growth, focus, creativity, and stability. And the longer it stays, the more normal the drain feels, that is the silent cost. You don't notice what you are losing because you are too focused on managing what is still there. And that is why removal is not an emotional reaction. It is strategic clarity. It is the understanding that your life cannot move forward while constantly dragging unnecessary weight behind it. Now, there is another layer to this that most people miss. When you remove toxic influences, you are not just subtracting negativity, you are restoring access to yourself. You begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. You begin to trust your instincts again. You begin to notice how much energy was being consumed just to maintain unstable connections. And in that space, something powerful returns. Your identity becomes louder than your confusion. You stop reacting. You start deciding. You stop managing people. You start managing your direction. And slowly, your life stops feeling like a reaction to others and starts becoming an expression of your own clarity. So when we say peace is created by removal, we are not talking about isolation. We are talking about alignment. The alignment of your environment with your standards, your value, the ES, and your mental stability. Because peace is not found in perfect people. It is found in protected space. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do for your future is not to add more understanding to the wrong connection, but to finally remove what keeps disturbing your clarity. And when you do that, you will realize something you should have known all along. Peace was never missing from your life. It was just buried under what you refused to let go of. One of the most misunderstood truths about toxic dynamics is this: they do not lose power over you when you get louder. They lose power over you when you get quieter in a very specific way. Not silence out of fear, not silence out of confusion, but silence that comes from emotional detachment, from clarity, from the decision that you are no longer participating in something that repeatedly disturbs your peace. Because toxic people are not just influenced by what you say, they are influenced by how you respond. Your reactions become their feedback system. Your emotions become their access point. Your frustration becomes their leverage. Your explanations become their entry into debate. But the moment you remove Chanel reaction from the equation, the entire system breaks. That is why silence is not emptiness in this context. It is control. When you stop reacting, you are no longer feeding the cycle. You are no longer rewarding the behavior with attention, energy, or emotional engagement. And for people who thrive on pushing buttons, this is the most uncomfortable outcome possible. Because they are not just trying to hurt you. They are trying to move you. They want you to react so they know they still have influence. They want you to explain yourself so they know they still have access. They want you to argue so they know the connection is still active. Even negative attention is still attention, and attention is still connection. But when you step into silence with awareness, something changes fundamentally. You stop treating every action as something that requires a response. You stop rushing to clarify every misunderstanding. You stop defending yourself in conversations that are clearly designed to destabilize you. And in that space, you begin to observe instead of absorb. That is where emotional intelligence actually begins, not in controlling others, but in controlling your response, the NSE to others. Now understand this carefully. Toxic people are highly sensitive to emotional availability. They may not always be consciously calculating it, but they can sense when they are still getting a reaction from you, a defensive reply, a long explanation, a frustrated message, a delayed attempt to fix things. To them, all of it signals the same thing: you are still emotionally engaged. And as long as you are emotionally engaged, you are still within reach. That is why your silence is misunderstood at first, because they are used to access. They are used to reaction. They are used to being able to pull you into cycles of explanation, correction, and emotional back and forth. So when you stop participating, they often mislabel it. They might call it attitude. They might call it pride. They might call it ego. They might even call it disrespect. But in reality, it is none of those things. It is detachment. And detachment is dangerous to toxic patterns because it removes the reward system that keeps them alive. Think about it clearly. If every attempt to provoke you results in no emotional return, the behavior loses its purpose. If every attempt to confuse you results in calm observation instead of panic response, the manipulation loses its effect. If every attempt to pull you into argument results in silence or short, clear responses, the control mechanism collapses. This is why emotional distance is more powerful than verbal confrontation, because confrontation still keeps you inside the system. Silence steps outside of it. And when you step outside, you stop playing a role in a dynamic that requires your participation to function. Now, here is something deeper that most people don't realize until they experience it. When you stop reacting, people who relied on your reactions will often escalate before they retreat. They may increase pressure. They may provoke harder. They may try guilt, nostalgia, or frustration to pull you back in. Not because they are becoming more powerful, but because they are losing influence. It is the final attempt of a fading pattern trying to restore control. But if you understand what is happening, you do not misinterpret escalation as urgency. You see it for what it is: resistance to your clarity. And clarity does not negotiate with resistance. At this stage, your silence is no longer just a response. It became, as a boundary enforcement system. You are no longer explaining your limits. You are embodying them. You are no longer arguing your position. You are withdrawing from what violates it. And that shift is what creates real change. Because toxic dynamics cannot survive where emotional reactions are no longer freely available. They require access to your emotional center. And when that access is removed, the structure collapses from within. But there is an important distinction that must be understood here. Silence is not avoidance. Avoidance is fear-based. It runs away from confrontation while still emotionally entangled. Silence, in the way we are discussing it, is awareness-based. It stays present mentally, but disengaged emotionally. You are not disappearing from the situation. You are just no longer feeding it. And that difference is everything. Because once you reach that level of control, you are no longer easily pulled into cycles that once consumed your energy. You are no longer easily manipulated by urgency, emotional pressure, or distorted narratives. You begin to see patterns without being pulled into them. And that is where freedom begins, not when people change, when your reaction to them changes. So understand this deeply. The goal is not to win arguments. The goal is not to prove your point. The goal is not to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. The goal is to protect your emotional availability. Because once your reactions are no longer accessible, your peace is no longer negotiable. And in that space of silence, you discover something powerful. You were never trapped by people. You were trapped by your responses to them. There comes a moment in life when you finally understand that letting go of certain people is not an emotional collapse, it is an identity correction. Because what you call losing people is often just the process of recovering yourself. And this is where most people get it wrong. They measure relationships by presence instead of impact. If someone has been in their life for a long time, they assume that longevity equals value. If there is history, they assume there must still be purpose. If there is familiarity, they assume there must still be alignment. But time does not validate toxicity. It only makes it more familiar. So when you remove toxic people from your life, it doesn't feel. I like a simple decision at first. It feels like loss. Your mind interprets it as something being taken away, something ending, something breaking. But that interpretation is based on attachment, not truth. Because what is actually happening is not loss, it is separation from an old version of you that tolerated what you now refuse to accept. And that is where the transformation begins. You are not just removing people. You are removing access points to your former self. The version of you that over-explained. The version of you that stayed quiet when you should have spoken. The version of you that confused patience with self-neglect. The version of you that called emotional exhaustion loyalty. That version of you was not weak. It was untrained. It was operating without boundaries, without clarity, without the awareness you have now. But you cannot evolve while staying loyal to environments that were built for your older self. So when you step away, it feels like discomfort because you are no longer recognizable to the patterns you once participated in. And that is exactly the point. Growth always creates a temporary sense of disconnection. You no longer fully belong to the past, but the future version of you is still forming. So you exist in a transitional space where everything feels unfamiliar. Even your decisions feel different. Even your silence feels different. Even your standards feel different. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means new. And most people misinterpret this stage. They assume that discomfort means they made a mistake. So they go back. They reconnect. They reopen doors they closed emotionally. Not because things have changed, but because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. But every time you return to what you have outgrown, you interrupt your own evolution. Because toxic environments do not just influence your emotions. They reinforce your identity. And when you keep returning, you reinforce the version of you that tolerates instability instead of the version of you that demands clarity. That is why leaving is not a single action. It is a continued commitment to not undo your progress. Now here is something deeper that most people don't realize until they distance themselves. Once the noise is gone, you start hearing yourself again. Not the version of you shaped by reaction, but the version of you shaped by award. Ennis. You start noticing how much energy was previously consumed just maintaining emotional balance in unstable dynamics. You realize how much mental space was taken by overthinking conversations, decoding intentions, managing responses, and predicting reactions. And in the absence of that noise, something powerful returns: mental clarity. You begin to think in straight lines again instead of emotional loops. You begin to feel present instead of constantly alert. You begin to make decisions based on direction, not defense. And this is why removal is not just about protection, it is about restoration. You are not just protecting your peace, you are restoring your potential. Because every toxic influence removed from your life is not just a subtraction of negativity, it is the return of capacity. Capacity to focus, capacity to build, capacity to create, capacity to think without distortion. And that capacity is what was being silently drained all along. Now understand this clearly. People who are meant for your growth will not require you to abandon yourself to keep them. They will not require constant emotional compromise. They will not require you to shrink your boundaries to maintain their comfort. But toxic dynamics often do the opposite. They demand flexibility from you while offering inconsistency in return. They expect understanding while resisting accountability. They expect patience while continuing patterns that require patience in the first place. And over time, that imbalance creates emotional fatigue that you begin to normalize. But normalization does not make it healthy. So when you finally choose to remove such influences, it is not an act of rejection. It is an act of recalibration. You are resetting your environment to match your standards instead of lowering your standards to match your environment. And that recalibration will feel uncomfortable at first because your system is adjusting to stability after prolonged instability. But eventually, something shifts. You stop confusing intensity with connection. You stop confusing chaos with care. You stop confusing history with alignment. And you start choosing based on clarity instead of familiarity. That is when your life begins to feel lighter, not because there is less happening, but because there is less distortion. And here is the final truth that ties everything together. When you remove toxic people, you are not creating emptiness in your life. You are creating space for your actual life to finally appear. Because what you were calling full was never fullness, it was interference. And the moment you clear that interference, you realize something that changes everything moving forward. You were never meant to carry what you just put down.